Hello and welcome back to another video. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this video I'll be going over a potential Russian Kharkiv offensive, how it will happen, what the strategies and tactics will be. The main reason I am going over this potential scenario is because of the recent developments across the front line, especially around the storming of Krasnodarivka and Chasiv Yar, as the Russians capture more and more defensive positions across the front line that are heavily fortified and forcing the Russians to commit a large number of troops at those sections. The more of those they capture, the more troops are freed up and the more offensive capacity and capabilities the Russians will have. In the scenario that the Russians capture Chasiv Yar and Krasnodarivka and keep advancing and keep pressuring the Ukrainian positions across the front, we'll see the Russians launch a larger offensive. I've given my take on multiple scenarios for such a large-scale massive offensive, but this will be a more toned-down, smaller-scale offensive focused solely around the Donetsk region, the Zaporizhia region, and the Kharkiv region. The main reason for that is this is a more likely scenario for the immediate future rather than the long-term war-ending future. There's the possibility that the Russians launch this summer offensive, this massive offensive in the summer. There's also a possibility they simply delay it to the winter or later than that to make sure that they gain much more success than what they are currently capable of getting. And that would mean smaller scale operations in the near future. Kharkiv, being the second largest city in Ukraine, is naturally no small scale offensive. It would require a massive offensive with massive use of forces by the Russians. However, compared to gaining control over the entirety of Ukraine, it is a small undertaking. It is likely that the Russians would launch an offensive to capture Kharkiv, regardless of their larger long-term plans, mainly due to the official narrative calling the Kharkiv city a Russian city within the Russian media and political space. Now that it is clear that the Russians definitely have an interest in capturing Kharkiv, the question is how will they go about it? To take a look at that, we have to look at three separate things. The first one is the fortifications the Ukrainians have in the area. Second one is the forces the Ukrainians have available in the area. And the third thing is the supply lines the Ukrainians have available in the area. First of the defenses, we see that the majority of the fortifications the Ukrainians have are to the northern border by Russia and Ukraine itself. We see that the majority of the Ukrainian fortifications in the area are built in that direction and along the entirety of the city outskirts, completely encircling itself in fortifications. To the east, we have the Oskar River line and Ukrainian fortifications in that direction as well, in the direction of Izium, Liman, and Kupiansk as the main areas, all three of which are targets for the Russian army as well. We see that there has been positional fighting taking place west of Kreminna for a long time, also in the direction of Sinkivka, with no significant advances by either side. The Russians have been inching towards the Serebets River line west of Kreminna and have failed to gain control over Sinkivka despite fighting over it for months. However, in this scenario, we see that the Russians actually launch a large-scale offensive and not just this small positional fighting that they're doing. They've learned recently how to deal better with FPV drones, adding electronic warfare equipment on tanks, as well as Seath Cage, which was recently revealed. So we see that there are definitely possibilities of the Russians overcoming the FPV drones if that is combined with a larger scale offensive operation where they can overrun these Ukrainian positions. Then there is a possibility of success for the Russians. And based on that, it is likely that the Russians in this scenario would focus on two separate sections of the front line. That is the northwestern parts and the eastern parts. The eastern parts would be centered around Russians capturing Kupiansk, Liman, and Izium. This would likely be focused around pushing westwards from Kreminna, southwards from the northern parts by the Russian border towards Kupiansk. And after capturing both of these and getting control over the eastern bank of the Oskar River line, they'll focus on attacking Izium from the east and from the north, going down from the Russian border and moving west of Liman. This would be a case similar to when the Russians first started their invasion in February of 2022. Now we see that this would be the eastern parts. As for the northwestern parts, the focus will be on the Ukrainian supply lines. Taking a look at the supply lines, there are two main supply lines. The first one comes from the north from the direction of Sumy down towards Kharkiv. It goes near the border and undergoes towards the Kharkiv direction. Then there's one from Poltava towards the southwest of Kharkiv, and one from Dnipro going both directly from the city towards Kharkiv and through Pavlograd towards Kharkiv. Those are the four supply lines in and out of Kharkiv towards the western Ukrainian positions, ignoring the ones towards Donetsk as they go through the southern parts through Izium and down to the south. If the Russians capture Izium, then this could be disregarded. This means that the Russians can see that the Ukrainians have supply lines that go all around the western, southern, and eastern parts of Kharkiv, meaning that if the Russians were to cut off the supplies of the Ukrainians, they would need to completely encircle the city. This is very unlikely to happen. The main reason for that is the fact that the Russians have not really done so that much since the start of the war. They did it with Mariupol and other areas, but recently the main focus has been to semi-encircle a city, to limit the supplies and not completely cut them off, to prevent a Ukrainian last stand similar to Mariupol, and to drain the Ukrainian supplies bit by bit instead of completely starving them out, leaving out an escape. If the Ukrainian army wishes to withdraw, then they're able to do that under fire. Therefore, if we zoom in, it is likely that the Russian focus to the northwest of the city would be to move along the roads towards the western roads of Kharkiv, while at the same time pushing from the east, gaining control over Kupiansk and Izium, would allow the Russians to then push towards Kharkiv from the east, similar to their positions prior to the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive. This would allow the Russians to start pressuring the Ukrainian positions in the forest areas to the southeast of the city, which would pressure the Ukrainian supply lines coming from Dnipro towards Kharkiv, as for the ones coming from Poltava and Sumy would be pressured from the northwestern direction, as the Russians would look to gain control over this intersection here to the west of Kharkiv. We see that there is this triangular road here, connected, well connected. If the Russians gain control over the central parts of this, they'll be able to cut off the supplies to the west and southwest of Kharkiv. This would allow only one road in and out of Kharkiv and no significant rail movement. This means that Kharkiv would be very significantly limited when it comes to resupply and the reinforcements arriving to the city from those areas, and instead the fighting will be taking place in the western and eastern flanks of Kharkiv. The Russians with this position would seek to strengthen their fortifications and fortified position, entrenching themselves within the flanks of Kharkiv and extending the battle by launching small assaults directly towards it from the Russian border. Compared to the Russians and Ukrainian supply lines, the Russians would have pretty much free supply going through to Belgorod and then resupplying their offensive operations by Kharkiv, while the Ukrainians would have very limited supply, as the supply situation in Ukraine would be significantly reduced due to the Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, and at the same time due to the limited supply they have in the first place. Not to mention the Russian hypothetical semi-encirclement of the city. With that, the Russians would be looking to slowly grind down the city by trying to push first the civilian population by hitting the electric grid of the city, after which they would heavily bombard the positions of the Ukrainian army within the city to make it very costly for the Ukrainians to hold on to it, and simply draw them out by pushing them out of the city, by limiting the supplies, and then slowly storming the city. If the Russians manage to launch such an operation where they gain control over the flanks, then the battle would have already been won at that time. We've seen that the Russians have successfully been able to defend as long as they entrench themselves in their positions, and since they have really strengthened their army by both the mobilization, conscription of volunteers, as well as providing the necessary equipment for the Russian army, soldiers fighting within the country. So we're seeing that there is a significant strengthening of the Russian army. The Russians have the necessary manpower, the necessary experience, the necessary equipment, the necessary everything to conduct such an operation. The only question is whether or not they will risk doing so, as it could cause heavy casualties on the Russian army, and they could also be defeated in it, which would be a huge loss to the current momentum that they already have. But if they succeed, they could lead to a massive advantage for the Russians across the front line here in the Kharkiv region. And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content.